Well, grace to you and peace from God the Father and from our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. So what do you think? Were those messages as warm and fuzzy to you as they sounded to me? Today's text, gosh, I just love being this part of Matthew, preaching all these wonderful texts about going to hell. It's just great. Yeah. You know, the pastors don't usually get the opportunity to get up here and pound the pulpit, but Matthew gives us these three wonderful parables in a row that can be used that way, but not me. I'm not going to do that. No, in fact, I'm going to talk today about this, the risk of doing nothing, because I do believe that's the underlying theme of today's stories. And there's two ways to read this Matthew parable of the talents. The first one is to think that talents means gifts and abilities and skills. And you've heard that before. I mean, the word talent, that's what it means in English. And it's one of those words that gets translated directly over from the Greek. They don't change it at all. Talent in the Greek, talent in the English. And if that's what you're hearing, then the sermon goes something like this. You should be like those slaves that have been given multiple talents, and then go out and use them to the best of your ability and make God proud. Or something to that nature, okay. You're not obviously resonating with that one, so I'll go with the other translation, which is to say that talents means money, right? And that sermon goes something like this. Money will not do God any good at all if you bury it in a hole in the ground. So you need to go out and use it to make more money, because the more you make, the more you can give, right? Yeah. Now, it's not hard to see why those two interpretations resonate with American Christians. Because the truth is, we're kind of enculturated in this whole notion about money and talents and entitlement and usefulness. And, we've got all this thing going on around us. My own father, who was as good a business person as ever existed, said to me so many times that I thought it was the 11th commandment, till I got, you got to spend money to make money. He was in the furniture business. And he was right. And this world loves to hear that the best thing you can do with money is to use it to make more money, right? I mean, we have whole cable news networks about making money and investing and that kind of stuff. Now, the only problem with that interpretation and the one about using your talents is that they're wrong. Even though I preached both of those sermons in the past. So, they may be what we want to hear as Americans. This is not, I've come to the conclusion, what Jesus is trying to say. So I want to look a little closer at what Jesus is trying to say today. But first, I think there's some things that you need to know in the Greek, because, I hate to waste this expensive seminary education by not, showing you how much Greek I can. Okay. The first one is that these talents are not given to just anybody. They're given to a doulos, Greek word. They're given to slaves. Now, I'm talking about members of the household or hired hands or paid workers. No. These people are as much property as the property they're receiving from the master. Slaves. Second, the master hands over, it says, Greek word is paradidomai, hands over his property to these slaves. And that word gets used a lot in the Bible, paradidomai. In fact, it's used most often here. The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands, handed over, of sinful men. It means, paradidomai, to give something that is of great value to somebody else. And the third thing you need to know is that what's given over is that word talent, talanta in the Greek. And a talanta is not a gift or a skill or an ability. It literally is a bucket of gold. Literally, that's what it means, a bucket of gold. And in case you're wondering what a bucket of gold is worth, it's about 50 pounds of gold, which is, according to the latest value, because there's 12.74 troy ounces to a pound. And that means that a bucket of gold today is worth about $944,323, give or take a few pennies, okay? Or rounding it up, $1 million. Each talent is worth $1 million. Now I want you to think about it for a second. That first of all, this guy had that kind of resources to give away. And second of all, that he gives it away to slaves. So this is not a story about how God gifts some people with different abilities. Some people get basketball skills, and some people get singing skills, and some people get, thinking skills. And it's not a story about how people make good investments if they just learn the rule of 72 or find a competent investment broker. This story is about the master going away and giving his property, his valuable property, to people who are on the lowest rung of the socioeconomic scale. It's an unimaginable sum, more than I'm going to make in a lifetime, one of them, more than I'm going to make in a lifetime. And it's asking the question of what they're going to do with that gift in the time that he's going to be gone. And the story says he's going to be gone a long time. There's a lot of O's in that long time. Which means nobody knows when he's coming back. Could be tomorrow, could be a talanta, a million years from tomorrow, who knows? And it begs this question for all of us who hear this story. What are we doing with the gift that God has given us and what that gift is, that valuable gift, that gift that is beyond measure, the gift that we would probably call the gospel, the good news, that God has come among us and will come again. What are we doing with that while we're waiting between the first and the second coming of our Master? The kingdom of heaven, Jesus says, is like a man who goes abroad and before he leaves calls his slaves together and gives his property over to them to manage while he is away. 3 slaves are given talanta, and the master is fully aware of their ability to use them. He gives them according to their own ability, the text says. So it's not like they're unequipped or unable to do with them what needs to be done. There are no unrealistic expectations. The master doesn't care if one slave is a proven investor and the other one is more intuitive. The master has taken all that into account before he hands over the first bucket of gold. Nor does it matter to him that one gets 5 and one gets 2 and one gets 1. They all have a treasure given, and with that treasure comes an obligation. When at long last he finally comes back, he calls these slaves to account, and the first 2 have doubled their talantas, and they've taken some considerable risk in doing this. And if you don't think there's risk involved in doubling your money, then you don't have any money. It is obvious they understood the responsibility that was given to them when they were handed that talanta, but they are unafraid to fail. And the master has glowing words for them. Well done, good and faithful slaves. Well done. The third took a different tack. I know you are a hard man, he says, reaping where you did not sow, gathering where you did not scatter, and I was afraid. So I took your talanta, and I dug a hole, and I buried it. Here it is, all safe and sound, shiny as the day you handed it to me, completely unused. And the master's response to this guy is not exactly what you would expect. You wicked and lazy slave. Wicked and lazy. You should have used what I gave you, but you didn't. So I'll take it away from you and give it to those who will put it to use. And then he says to those other servants, and this good-for-nothing reprobate, throw him out. I don't want to see him anymore. He's no longer part of my household. Now, one lesson of the story is to whom much is given, much is expected. But you don't want to hear that, do you? That's too uncomfortably close to the truth. Another lesson seems to be the kingdom of heaven on earth, which, by the way, it can happen according to this parable at least, has something to do with what we do or do not do with the talantas that have been entrusted to us. Will we take a risk for the sake of the gospel, or will we be frozen by fear? And we'd better figure it out because, according to the story, there's a day of reckoning coming. One will lead to the kingdom of heaven, the other will lead to hell. One will lead to the master saying, well done, good and faithful slaves, and the other one will say, you wicked and lazy person, and cast him into the outer darkness. Warm and fuzzy, right? This is a story about responsible stewardship, about how one manages the gift of God. It's one thing to be a pinch penny conservative with your stuff. It's another to be that way with God's stuff. Why do I say this? Because God could have hidden that talent in a hole in the ground all by himself. He doesn't need us to do that. When he gives it to us, there's a deep and profound expectation, an obligation that we're going to use it. So holding back, Jesus says, avoiding risks, living in a constant state of fear, that is no way for a disciple to live. None. Get it out of your head. That's the sermon I'm preaching today. C.S. Lewis once said that if you want to save your heart from breaking it, simple, don't give it away. If you want to save your heart from breaking, don't give it away in love. Bury it deep in a hole. Because what could be more risky than to make a promise for as long as life lasts relationship by giving your heart to somebody else? Just don't do it. You'll be lonely. You'll be singular, but you won't be taking a risk. Or how about this one? What could be more risky than having children? Investing 18 or more years of your life and your treasure in raising some third person who will never appreciate what you've done for them and will probably screw it up. At least if I've talked to every other parent in here, that's the way it seems to work. No guarantee of success there. None. What could be more risky to bring it home than running for an elected office in this country? Investing your time, your energy, your faith, your resources, your good name, with the likely possibility of losing, or worse, winning. Better to play it safe. Let somebody else do that. But if you want to change the world, you better be ready to take a risk, because that's the way it happens. William Sloane Coffin, who was the chaplain at Harvard School of Divinity, once suggested that paralyzing fear is the biggest problem in the church today. Coffin himself was a risk taker. He invested himself totally in issues of racial justice and gender equality and war and peace. He wrote these words: "Love seeks the truth. Fear seeks safety." So just ask yourself, what's more important to you? You can't change the world if you refuse to take any responsibility for it. And for the record, responsibility for this world appears on the very first page of the Bible. God creates man and woman, places them in a garden, gives them dominion. What do you think that word meant? Responsibility. He puts us in charge to manage his talanta. And in case you think that's a big risk that we all should avoid, you're right. Turn the page. The second page is about how we screw that up by avoiding responsibility. The snake persuades Eve to eat the fruit. Eve persuades Adam, and when they all get confronted, guess what happens? Adam blames Eve, Eve blames the snake, and all of them blame God. "The woman that you gave me," Adam says. "The snake that you created," Eve says. The snake goes, didn't have arms, so I'm just guessing. Everybody gets confronted, but nobody is to blame. The world we now live in is a product of that kind of thinking. We call it sin. And this is why fear rules our thinking. We become so risk averse, and it's not good, because we are facing some big problems. Let's just talk about one: global warming. 97.2% of all published climate scientists, let me say that again. I'm not arguing about politics here. 97.2% of all published climate scientists believe that human dependence on fossil fuels is one of the major reasons for this ecological collapse. 97.2%. Did you hear that? 97.2%. I can't get 97.2% of you to agree on the color of the carpet in this place. But you talk to any politician, I don't care what party they're from, anyone. They all seem to live in this carefully preserved and continually reinforced bubble. They will tell you that if global warming is real, and they're not so sure that it is, it ain't our fault. It's happened before. Look, 20,000 years ago, we were there. And they probably were. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, remember this guy? He once said the greatest sin of respectable people is to run away from their responsibility. And he knew something about what he spoke of, because his life and his academic career were both cut short when he took on the personal responsibility of going home to his beloved Germany to face what was happening there. He quit a lucrative position at Union Theological Seminary, hopped on the last steamship to leave New York Harbor before the outbreak of World War II, and went home to participate in the confessional church. He was later implicated in the plot to kill Hitler, imprisoned in a concentration camp, and 1 week before the end of the war, when that camp was liberated, he was hung by the SS on gallows. For him to believe in and to follow Jesus meant that he needed to be a responsible citizen. And by the way, Luther taught us the same thing. So as this story goes, sin is real. And there are some who will bury the gospel in a hole to avoid dealing with it. But here's the good news. That's only the last third of that story. I want to focus on the first 2/3. About those other times when the talents are put to use and they're doubled. Because even though it's not the kind of news we normally watch or see on the idiot box on the 24 cable news networks, it is not as rare as we have come to believe. A couple years ago, Thomas Friedman wrote a book called Hot, Flat, and Crowded, talking about the earth. He wrote these words: young people are so much more idealistic than we deserve them to be. I think the broader public, though beaten down at times, yearns to be enlisted in causes bigger than itself. To fix education, to research renewable energy, to repair our infrastructure, to help other people. As for myself, I would go through a gauntlet of 5 metal detectors every time I flew out of Washington if I believed there was a great project worthy of America on the other side of them, and not just this Midland war on terrorism. We need America. The world needs America to be something more than the United States of fighting terrorism. Of course, we must never forget who our enemies are. But more important than that, we must always remember who we are. George Bernard Shaw once wrote, "The true joy of life is being used for a purpose, a mighty purpose bigger than yourself, being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little collection of grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making us happy. When I die," he wrote, "I want to be thoroughly used up, because I believe that the harder I work, the more I live. I rejoice in life for its own sake. It is no brief candle to me. It is instead a splendid, fiery torch, which I have been privileged to hold for the moment, and I will burn it as brightly as possible before I hand it on to the next generation." The world, we know, trades on fear, and fear paralyzes. It prevents us from doing what needs to be done, prevents us from taking any risks at all. Fear never takes risks, and yet, in spite of this, Thomas Friedman observed the idealism of America's young people at work as he traveled. In that same book, he was traveling with Admiral William Fallon, the time chief of CENTCOM. He went to a field hospital in central Iraq, and this is what he wrote: "The madness that was Iraq was on full display. U.S. soldiers with shrapnel wounds from suicide bombers, insurgents with gunshots to the gut, a handicapped 2-month-old baby with wounds from an IED. Admiral Fallon chatted with the staff who were on overlapping rotations, 30, 60, 100, and he asked them how they managed. And a voice from the back, a young nurse, piped up, "Because we're all the same team, sir." And I looked around the room, and I saw African Americans, and Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans, and Caucasian Americans, the whole melting pot that is the American dream, all working together. Half of them women who left behind children and families to serve 6 months or longer. And I walked away shaking my head, and I thought, what have we done to deserve such good people as this? People of Christ, I walk away from this church every other day thinking the same thing. When I see what you do in this community and what you do for each other, what have I done to deserve such good people as you? I know that for many, personal religion rarely seems like a risk. In fact, it seems like the opposite, like a comfort zone. No more risky than believing certain ideas about God, no more risky than adhering to a list of beliefs to which we more or less intellectually subscribe. I know in this world religion has become a timid, non-risky thing, but this story says the greatest risk of all is to do nothing at all with the faith you've been given. To not care deeply or profoundly about anything, to avoid investment, to never give your heart away, to never risk anything that really matters, but God has made you responsible for his world, for its institutions and this nation, the future of the gospel and the life of this church. Not me, not the new members you haven't met yet, not somebody younger or richer or better equipped, but you. God has given you a talent and asked you to use it according to your ability. He's given you a treasure, and it's not more than you can handle. You may not always feel that way, but you are in charge, no one else. And in this story, the Christ of God calls us to live life passionately and responsibly and fully, and to take the risk of loving. And remember, this is a risk Jesus himself took first. to come down and be among us, to speak and to love those whom he knew ultimately would betray and crucify him. And then it was to those very people he handed the whole shooting match over and said, now it's your responsibility. But when it's all said and done, it's also our greatest privilege and our greatest joy. To God be the glory. Amen.